Guten Abend von meiner Seite. Schön, dass ich hier sein darf. Ob ich das große Finale bestreiten kann.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to be here, and I think it's a very interesting topic I will talk about. It's about the media and journalism, and I did a lot of research about this topic when I was at the University of Zurich. Since last October, I'm the professor for communication at the Technical University of Dresden, and I still do research with climate communication. And the experience that I have is that the topic between climate research and journalism, the relation is not always easy. When you talk to climate scientists and researchers, they think that the journalists do not explain it correctly or do not communicate it correctly. It's too simple, or they turn the words around. And when you talk to journalists, they think that the scientists, the researchers, they cannot make a good point. So you see there are different interests that are in conflict with each other. And of course, the majority of the people are here researchers and scientists, and that's why I want to tell you something about how to understand climate journalists. I want to explain to you what we know, how climate journalists work, not the individual people, but in general. There are some findings, and that might be interesting to you. So when you look at the role of climate journalists are very prominent. So you see some climate journalists here. These are the superstars, Bill McKibben, Andrew Revkin. So they are almost politicians. They won many awards. Also Georges Monbiot. In the middle you see Axel Bojanowski. Maybe you know him. He writes in the Spiegel about climate change. And this is the group of the people who are in favor of the climate science. But there are also people like Deborah Saunders. They are part of the climate skepticism and the climate deniers. And Fritz Fahrenhold, who wrote the book The Cold Sun, and he writes well-known articles in the newspaper Bild-Zeitung, and Christopher Bucher, so one representative of the climate deniers. And this is the wide range of climate journalism, and you see the influence that climate journalists can have. They are important people in the public, and it's not a question that they really emphasize and put a focus on the news about climate change. So the influences, there is a ring model for these influences. In the middle, there are the individuals, and then around it, in a hierarchical model, you have the different influence factors that have their input or their influence on the individuals. So you have the routine practice, the influence factors of the media organizations, the newspapers, the TV channels, then more circles around it about social institutions, social systems, international national cultures, and so on. And so during the next minutes, I would like to guide you through these rings from the inside to the outside, and will show you what research knows about the individual influences. So what is most important are the influences of the personal background. So we know a lot how people think about climate change. There is a lot of research about this, and this can be also transferred to the journalists themselves. So the personal background. What is important is the sex. The sex plays a role, male, female. We know that men basically are more skeptical about climate change, so we can find this in all studies. It's not yet clear why it's like this. There is an interesting theory that says that climate change is an attack to the classical masculine identity. So the classic stereotype man, male, likes to consume carbon dioxide, so he likes meat, he likes to drive the car, and that's why he thinks he will be more limited in his lifestyle because of the climate change than a woman. So this is one of the theories that tells you why men are more skeptical against climate change. And we find this in the data of every survey. Regarding education, usually it's when you have a higher education, then the people are more open towards research and the findings, and then they accept climate change much more. But this is not always like this. There are also some people who are, for ideological reasons, deny the climate change, and when they have a high education, they can give proof to this, and they can find arguments against it. So it's not this easy that you think you have to educate the people and then they will accept the reality of climate change. Then, of course, the political leaning is important. We know that people that have a more conservative attitude, they are more against climate change, but it's not so clear why. So usual theories say, common theories say that many people who belong to the right wing of politics are also closer to economy, and that's why they are more skeptical about climate change. But it's not this easy. It's similar to religion. So regarding religion, people that are more religious accept climate change much less. So in the United States, religious people are against it, but it's not always like this. It depends also from the kind of religion and what role the environment and the attitude to environment plays a role in the religion. For example, Bill McKibben, who was one of the big activists for climate change movement. So he is a Methodist, and you can see sometimes religion does not play a role in this. Then the topic-specific knowledge. The more people know, the more educated they are. It's different that they how they communicate climate change. But many journalists don't have a specific education about climate change. So you cannot expect this. There is a small group of journalists who have good information, who have sometimes more information than the scientists, the researchers, but the broad range of journalists do not even have a natural science background, but they have to communicate for different fields. So there were studies about journalists who write about the climate change to find out what is their background knowledge about climate change itself. And then it also depends on the attitude that the people have towards climate change. So the personal attitude also plays a role. And this is formed by different factors. And this personal opinion is part of the cognitive frame. So people have frames in the head for different topics, and when they hear about climate change, they have certain pictures and symbols in their heads. And it's the same also for the journalists. And these cognitive frames will influence also how journalists write about climate change. And at the end, also the professional role plays a big role. So what is how the journalist sees himself as mediator, as entertainer, as investigative journalist who wants to make sure that the researchers tell the truth. So when you sum this up, you could say that inside the head of the journalist there is the interaction of these different models, and at the end there is the news decision how they will write about climate change. So there are different factors like demographics, education, the professional experience, the political opinion, the knowledge and the professional role, and also the attitude. So this is a complicated process, and that's why it's important to know the journalists that you are talking to know what kind of people they are, how they work, how they function, in order to understand how they will write about climate change. But it's not only the individual context of the journalists, but they are part of these rings, of these circles. And that's why I want to explain it a little bit further. The journalists cannot write what they want to, but there are professional norms, standards. So these are the ideas of good journalistic practice that were formed and that are transferred from journalist to journalist. So these are informal rules and guidelines. They are not written down. It's how you are socialized, and they have different functions. First, they serve for shaping professional identity. But these rules and guidelines can also make sure that the head, the editor, has control over the employees, and it also serves quality control. So this exists everywhere, and they are acquired by professional socialization. And the standards that are most important are the following. So the news factors, for example, journalists write about news when they have certain properties, certain feature surprise, or broad range, or the height of the cost of the damage, or the benefit. And depending on this, so with climate change, when you have events that have more news characters, then they are written more about it. So some events are like catastrophes, where there's a lot of news about this. The second standard is that journalists like to orient meditate on authorities, or they use authorities as role models. So journalists really follow the role of the government, for example, in foreign policy. So many media really follows the role of the government for certain positions. And then another standard is important, and this is the balance. So especially with climate change, this is important. So is it good to write about, to report on climate change in a balanced way, so that you always have a pro and contra? So in the two-party system of the United States, this makes sense. You have the Republicans and the Democrats, but in climate change, so if you have a representative of the World Climate Council and you have an important denier of the climate change, then of course the distribution of the opinions is not correct, how it is distributed in the research, in the science. So 97 to 98% of the scientists are convinced that climate change takes place, and when you have the two opinions, one pro, one contra, then it's not the correct balancing. And so this balancing changes a little bit, and there is more proportional balancing, not always 50%, 50%. Then there is something that's called media logic. So that's something general that sums up a lot of things. For example, every media has their own laws. And when you have a visual media, it's important that you have pictures, photos, film. If you don't have this, then you won't publish the news. So for many media, it's important to have pictures and videos and things like this. And if you have an abstract event where there are no pictures about it, then of course this is bad for publishing the news. So these are the standards that are used by journalists, but there are also editorial lines or slants. We know that the media has certain political attitude, so it's good like this. We want to have a big variety, and we want to have media with different positions, and you can find about this in research. There are studies that show that, for example, the Times and the Telegraph, so that they have a critical editorial line towards climate change. In the United States, it's Fox News, and with President Trump, it's even more than before. But also for the press, like the Wall Street Journal. So, because it's economically friendly. And so maybe if you know about this a little bit, then maybe you can do the same typologically for the German media. So who is more climate change friendly, who is more skeptical. What I think is very interesting, for example, Spiegel Online, it's very hard to find the position. They are really friendly to scientists, but they want to find out some inconsistency. And so this is some interesting mediating role. So these are the standards for certain organizations, and there are some communities like Twitter and other social media. So the journalists, they have a network, they follow with Twitter and they follow certain scientists, and that's why there are the influences of so-called interpretation communities. So you are in communities with people who have the same opinion, and they meet on Twitter or something like this. So these interpretation communities have a long tradition in journalism. When you have an event, what it's not so easy to be interpreted, when journalists are not sure how to interpret this, so they check what the others are writing about and they follow these. And so these are some common interpretation of key events, and this is linked to the World Climate Council and also to the World Climate Conferences. So the latest assessment report of IPCC, and so they interpret this together. So this is also something between scientists and journalists. But there is also this so-called denial machine. So there is an environmental socialist who made up this word, especially in the United States. There are foundations of rich families, and they have think tanks, and they have scientists, or groups of scientists who work strategically to undermine the findings of climate research, and also some journalists belong to this community, to this interpretation community. There are two interpretation communities. You can even see this on Twitter very well. So they live in their own parallel universe. So and this is like an echo chamber. So you stay in your community, and then this opinion is enhanced, and you have the feeling that everybody thinks as you think, although it's not like this. And at the end, also some influences of the national cultures. Of course, there are also national differences, but of course it's hard to determine because there are many influencing factors on the national scheme. But there are studies that show that there are different journalistic cultures, even in the Western democracies. There are different journalistic cultures. Some European countries maybe are more educational in their attitude as journalists, or than the American culture. Or when you leave democracies and you go to other countries where there are more authorities, the journalistic culture is different there, and this will also influence how they report on climate change. Also, the political culture plays a role. There was a study of Grundmann and Scott, and it shows that in countries where you have the civil society and it's very strong, and an active political culture, then it will also have an influence on the journalistic culture. And there is also a certain scientific culture in countries where science plays a big role. So in Germany it's a little bit ambivalent. In other countries science plays a bigger role. For example, in Japan science has a very big role. and there the journalistic culture
Ja,
is
also
also
es gibt natürlich
different.
darüber hinaus noch ganz viele andere Faktoren,
So there are
aber
many
ich
more
dachte, ich zeige
factors,
immer so ein
but
bisschen,
I thought
was es für Faktoren
I
gibt
show
und wie
you
die
some
alle
of the factors and
zusammenspielen.
how they work, how
Wenn Sie
they
das nächste
interact.
Mal irgendeinen
And
Bericht
when you
sehen
read
oder
the next
irgendeinen
report, or
journalistischen
when you
Beitrag,
see
werden Sie dazu
something on
schauen,
TV
lehnt
and
Sie
you are
wieder
not sure
zurückdenken
about this,
und
so
dann,
maybe you think back of
vielleicht
this
ist der
presentation
Faktor,
and
die Engesser da damals
maybe
genannt
it's
hat, der da
this
eine Rolle spielt.
factor that Engesser talked
Es ist
about,
natürlich auch gut, wenn man
which plays a
diese
role in
Faktoren
this.
kennt, weil man
And
kann
it's
natürlich auch,
good to
wenn
know
man sein
about these
Gegenüber kennt,
factors,
dann auch
and when you
besser
know
argumentieren.
the person you are
Und das
talking
lässt sich
to,
natürlich auch
then you
statistisch
can find
nutzen.
better
Ja, an der Stelle
arguments.
möchte ich, schließen und vielleicht haben Sie
So
noch eine oder
that's
andere
the
Frage.
end of my presentation, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer it.
Herzlichen Dank, Herr Engesser, für
Thank
diese
you, Mr.
Beleuchtung.
Engesser,
Und,
for this
wir sind
enlightening.
natürlich mit den Vorträgen jetzt am Ende.
So that's the end of
Ich
the
möchte aber
presentations.
sicherlich die Gelegenheit
But
geben,
if you
das
want
noch zu
to
diskutieren.
ask a question or want to have a discussion about this, of course it's possible.
Erstmal schön, dass Sie kommen konnten. Das, glaube ich,
Thank
nochmal
you
eine
for
Bereicherung, dass man
coming.
versteht, wie
That was
manche
really nice,
darüber denken, wie
and
wir
it's nice to know.
Informationen zu übermitteln und dass dann auch
We
noch
try
Multiplikatoren für
to
Journalisten.
communicate
Ich habe
information
ein Problem
to
mit der
journalists.
Entwicklung in den
So
letzten
I have a
Jahren
problem
passiert
with
ist,
the
diese
development during the last years, so a little bit fake news. So you said when there is a higher education,
besser argumentieren kann,
you can find better arguments for things, although there is no proof. So I think it's the other way around. So the argument is not used to convince people, but somebody says something that I think is the same as something that somebody else thinks. It doesn't matter if you're an expert or not. How would you handle this? This is a very good question. And if I had an easy solution, a simple solution, then I would be here.
Ich kann, also was ich wirklich sagen muss, ist,
What I
dass wir
have
das
to say
natürlich in allen
is
Bereichen beobachten.
we have this in
Und,
all the
ich glaube, das hat sehr
fields,
stark damit zu tun, dass eben
and
die affektive
this
Komponente
is
hier eine große Rolle spielt.
with the affective component.
Die Gesellschaft ist gerade
So
in den
the
USA
society, especially in the United States, it's very polarized. You have different
in welchem Lager das ist. Gehört das zu
regions,
mir oder gehört das
and
zu den
you
anderen?
think if it belongs to the same group or to another group. And climate change,
Irgendwie in die öffentliche Diskussion
when
treten,
you
dann haben sie
talk
gleich
about
den
this
Stempel,
in
egal was sie
public,
davon sagen, ja. Also
it doesn't matter
findet
what
statt
you
oder
say,
findet nicht statt,
climate
wenn es
change
gleich
takes place or takes not
Und dann
place,
ist es schwierig,
you are
da
put in a
aus
certain
diesem Lager überhaupt
position,
herauszukommen.
and it's hard to get out of this
Deswegen ist es
position again.
eigentlich eine
And
sinnvolle
that's why
Strategie,
it would make sense
versuchen, diese Abstempelung zu vermeiden.
to try
Also, dass man irgendwie
to not
versucht,
be
das
put
Thema
into a
irgendwie
certain
in die
position.
Debatte zu bringen, ohne gleich in ein
So-
Lager gesteckt zu werden.
So try
Aber
to
das ist
discuss
eine
about the topic
schwierige
without
Sache. Und es gibt sehr
being
viele
placed
Forscher
in a
daran,
certain
wenn man diese
position.
Lager der Gesellschaft
But this is hard to
zusammenzubringen,
do,
miteinander zu
and
reden.
there are
Und,
also research done
da
and
haben wir
studies
aber
done
noch keine
how
guten
to
Empfehlungen.
combine the people again, but we don't have any recommendations
Die
yet for
Hypothese
this.
wagen,
So I
das,
think
was
there
Sie
is
uns
the
jetzt
hypothesis,
vorgestellt haben, am Beispiel von Journalisten,
so what
als
you
Teil
talked
unserer
about
Gesellschaft,
as an example for the
auf die
journalist,
Gesellschaft
as
übertragen
part
wird,
of the
Journalisten
society,
nicht
you
weiter
could
als
even
ein
transfer
Bild
this
der
to the
jeweiligen
society itself,
Gesellschaft
because
sind. Ich habe
journalists
also
are only
tatsächlich die ganze Zeit so eine Art
one
Flashback,
part of the society.
im Raum erinnern sich an
And
die Annaberger
I had
Klimatage
a
09,
flashback
wo der Verfasser
to the
dieses
9th
Buches, Mike Hume, hier
Annaberger
war.
Climate Days.
Original, Why We
Mike
Disagree
Hume
About
was
Climate
here,
Change, auf Deutsch
why we
Streitpunkt
disagree
Klimawandel,
about
Franz
climate
dazu,
change, Streitpunkt
der das eben
Klimawandel,
für die
the book,
gesellschaftliche Ebene
who was talking about this on the
intensiv
range
mit einer
of
sehr
the
scharfen Liste
society,
auseinandergenommen hat und quasi fast identische Liste
and had
zusammengestellt
almost
hat,
an
die
identical list
ähnlich
as
begründet.
you had.
Und da haben wir natürlich auch im Sinne der Frage von
And
Christian
so
Bahnhofer,
also
da haben
with
wir
the
eine
question of
gigantische
Christian Bernhofer,
Herausforderung.
this is
Ich
a
glaube, das ist auch
big
eine andere
challenge.
Herausforderung, wie sie bisher
And this
in
is
der
also a
Menschheitsgeschichte
challenge
so noch
that
nicht
we
existiert hat,
haven't had
was
before
diesen
in
Diskurs
human
anbetrifft. Weil mit einem
mankind.
Mal sind wir in einer Situation,
because we are in a situation, so certain values which were always in a forward discussion, suddenly there is a retrospective discussion. So to try to find the future with solutions of the past. So that's what really happens. And I don't expect to have the answer to this, but I think that's really something we have to solve. And I would be glad when you personally will be part in this discussion with this professorship that you have, doing research about this. This is a big task for the next decades.
Ja, also ich muss Ihnen da natürlich total zustimmen. Und,
yes, you're right. I can confirm this. And also what Mike Human wrote, there is not so much to add to this, but we have to consider the affective component in this. So many things happen because we are rationally acting people. But what I said at the beginning about the men who deny climate change because of their lifestyle, it will influence their lifestyle. People have their feelings and many things are not rational. And when we talk about this, we don't talk about the feelings, we only talk about rational things. So that's important also for science, to how to address the emotions that are connected to climate change, and how can the people react to us emotionally and not only cognitively. But to research emotion, it's much more difficult than research information.